Okay, so without further ado, here is Dr. Mark Schwartz.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us again. And just as a brief introduction once again, previously I was the director of Masters and Johnson Institute. So I have a lot of interest in both hypo and hyper-sexuality as it relates to eating disorders. And that's what we'll be talking to you about. Today we're going to be focusing mostly on how to do therapy with eating disorder clients with sexual difficulties, and doing less theoretical stuff and getting down to really practical stuff. Okay, so just to begin with, the eating disorder allows you to bypass, override, and transcend. And so if you can just get started by beginning to imagine recovering from eating disorder. They're feeling more in their body than they've ever been before. They're not numb like they were before. They're coming back to the relationship with their husband or their wife. And what happens is that it's as if the relationship is new, it's fresh, they're even more vulnerable and sensitive and reactive than ever before. And so what you're beginning to do is work on rebuilding that relationship, because most relationships with eating disorder has been built around the eating disorder, and the eating disorder obviously is a kind of like having an affair. So there's a third party in the relationship. So once you're beginning to restructure the relationship without the affair, there's a new level of intimacy. One couple I worked with said that it felt so intense that they really needed to get remarried and have a new marital contract, because there are implicit and explicit rules in all marital contracts. When you have the eating disorder, you have one contract. When you have the eating disorder left behind, then typically there's another. Now, I'm aware that a person's recovering doesn't mean that they're going to not have the eating disorder, but true, once you get under control of the eating disorder, there is a new degree of vulnerability. And so not only is the relationship much more intense, but then sexuality is more intense. And so the same woman said that when she got in the bedroom with her husband, it was just too much. It was like just being on a first date with somebody, and it was far too intense. And so they needed to slow it down and just get to know each other in the bedroom again and learn how to interact. There's some people who have absolutely no idea what normal is. And so sex to them is what we used to call at Masters and Johnson, kiss the lips, touch the breasts, and dive to the pelvis disease. And what we meant by that is that, there was this habit where men in particular would, kiss the woman a couple times and then touch the breasts and try to fondle them, and then feel down there almost like it was a dipstick, trying to see if she was wet. And if she was wet, then he would put the penis in the vagina, thrust for 3 to 5 minutes, and then ejaculate. And, that it really is not sufficient for most women to be orgasmic on a consistent basis. And it's rather crude. So oftentimes they have no frame of reference of what healthy interaction in the bedroom would look like. So to give them some frame of reference, you have to begin to know that people talk, that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big bang, but that you can touch for a while, that you can talk for a while, you can laugh for a while, you can play for a while, you can put breasts and genitals on limits, you can take breasts and genitals off limits, and that there be, kind of an interaction. So sometimes I'll use films as a way of beginning to at least give them a frame of reference for that. And usually the films are too much for them to watch also, so I like to put the film on for maybe 3 to 5 minutes and then discuss it in some way, just to let them have some frame of reference. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see this woman has what we call dead eyes, and the man who's obviously very fond of her. And I think that if you want to work on body image, there's nothing better than beginning to allow the man, in this case, to begin to admire the woman and let her know that how he feels. And so, the next question in intimacy in a relationship is, how often do you tell the other person what you like about them? And my answer to that is every day. And so, what his eyes are saying in this picture is, I love you, I care about you, I'm attracted to you. And if she's in the nude and he is being able to say that to her, there's nothing that's going to help her body image more than seeing her reflection in his eyes. And so obviously with those dead eyes, it's going to be hard to be able to do that. So what we hope is that after we've been able to do the work with the eating disorder, she's going to begin to receive the message. And so a lot of the body image work can be done with the other in the room. This next slide is a picture of looking in the mirror at oneself. And I mentioned last time that oftentimes when a person has body dysmorphia, the image that they see when they look in the mirror is not them. And so what they're beginning to do is see their image in their partner's eyes, and they begin to see themselves as beautiful, as not overweight, as attractive, as interesting, and not just in the physical sense, in the body sense, but that it emanates from inside the soul. And so this next slide then is beginning to show some real passion. I mean, the feeling I get from this picture is that these two people are really kissing. And, this kiss to me would be very intimate, very passionate, and in some ways looks like a new relationship in that way. And she is dressed in a sort of provocative way, and he's undressed. So the fact is they seem to really be enjoying themselves. And so, when you think of sexuality, most people think of penis and the vagina. So you want to let them know that the entire skin is a sex organ, and just the way she's touching his neck is so sensual and so erotic that that kind of touch can be as terrific as playing with his penis or playing with her vagina. So just to get sex out of the context of just in terms of genitals, but beginning to see that there's electricity in the air and beginning to open the couple up to passion. For most eating disorder clients, this is brand new. On the other hand, we've talked about the fact that the eating disorder client oftentimes is restrictive on one end and binges on the other end. So, with your husband, you're sort of aversive or have really lack of desire, but, the same person can go out with a stranger and have this kind of passionate sex and become more sexually addictive or compulsive. So it's a mystery to them why it is that with their regular partner they can be hyposexual, and that with a new partner they can be hyper-sexual. With their partner they can be lack passion, but with a new partner they can begin to be far more passionate. Anyway, it's helpful to build upon their experiences with other partners and bring it into the room with their regular lover. And of course, the reason why this is so is because what goes on in the bedroom is really an extension of the attachment. And all eating disorder clients have difficulty with attachment. So we're going to be talking some more about that. Okay. So what we left off last time is with this slide, and women as subject versus object. And obviously, when you have an eating disorder, your body becomes objectified. You live within that object, and the eating disorder contains the object. And what you hope is that by this phase of the therapy, the woman is less objectifying. And what comes with that is that the woman doesn't have much of a frame of reference of what it's like to be subject versus object. So if you think about it, if you're living your life as a woman and you're an object, and you want to present yourself as sort of tits and ass, to use that horrible phrase, which is kind of the objectifying of what you think men want, then you want to begin to have some kind of reference of what women is as subject and as opposed to object. And that's the woman who begins to see herself as a person and begins to see herself as beautiful as a person. And so in that, we use the language of being able to be in self. This is borrowed from Dick Schwartz in his concept of being in self. And being in self means that you're able to really inhabit your body and see yourself as a whole person and begin to find aspects of yourself as a person that you really like, and that you have a relationship with self that is not one which is critical and perfectionistic and continually being negative, but finding things that you adore about yourself and like about yourself and not see that as necessarily being narcissistic. Also, in this next slide, you get the image of women as object. And in this slide, what you see is sort of the man who's looking kind of bored and the woman who's utterly bored. And so both of them are so numb that they have to dress up in this way. Not that there's anything wrong with dressing up, but dressing up you want to be as icing on the cake rather than as a way of dealing with boredom and emptiness in the relationship. And if two people love each other, then these things become just a game that you're able to play, as like adding salt and pepper to your food, but not be, really at the core of what's been necessary. So what we oftentimes is separate where you are able to use these extra things as an enhancer rather than an elicitor. As an elicitor, you require these things in order to get aroused. As an enhancer, they just become icing on the cake. And you've got to be able to look at that. Sexual fantasies are examples of that. Some people immediately leave their partner and go into a sexual fantasy as a way of getting themselves aroused. And when you do that, you're highly objectifying yourself and objectifying the other. So not only do we have to worry about women as object, but also men as objects. Men who are married or in relationships with clients with eating disorder oftentimes have similar issues and oftentimes see themselves as objects and are heavily into performance and try to please the woman and make her orgasmic. And, if a woman has difficulties with sexuality, the man really wants to come in there and be the one on the white horse who's going to just fuck her and make her orgasmic and be the magic penis that's going to, elicit the response and say, no man can make a woman orgasmic. And that has to be emphasized over and over again. A woman allows herself to be orgasmic, and a man can help and facilitate, but you want to get out of the role as men as somehow making the woman orgasmic. This next slide then brings us back to eating disorder. And this is a form of pornography. This is a woman taken off of one of the pro-ana websites who, looks at her pictures of herself every day in this way, and it's grotesquely pornographic and becomes sort of a source of her own erotic arousal into anorexia, and just tells you how self-involved the person with the eating disorder can become. And so it's a way of really protecting themselves. So I want to use this as a bridge now to begin to talk more about attachment and eating disorder and attachment and sexual behavior. And I want to bring you into maybe a Patricia Crittenden kind of analysis of this. In her analysis, what she suggests, based upon her work with Mary Ainsworth, was that people have predictable attachment styles. And one of those is going to be a dismissive form of attachment, which she calls type A. And the other is a preoccupied form of attachment, which we would call type C. And more than 50% of couples have these two patterns in the United States. Dismissive means a form of disconnecting in order to be safe, and preoccupied means where you cling to somebody else in order to be able to bond in some ways because you're so empty you just need them in a dependent way. And what we find with our eating disorder clients is that they have both patterns and they switch from one to the other. So if you can think of it with regards to sexuality, what one has to do is look at both the affective and the cognitive ways of the brain interacting. When you are dismissive of attachment, what occurs is that you become very cognitive, and you try to override and over-control. And so you try not to have feelings, you try not to be aroused, you try not to have hunger and appetite, and you try to use your control mechanisms to override this. Men do this too. They try to go in there and not ejaculate rapidly, so they try to distract themselves and think of, counting sheep or something like that in order to be able to be less excited. well, women can do a variety of things to disconnect, and one of the things they can do is become anorexic as a way of disconnecting. Now, on the other end, in the preoccupied pattern, a woman becomes highly affectively charged. In that case, she's very dependent, very needy, and very emotional, and really almost becomes what we might call a love addict, where they become more and more obsessed with needing the other person in order to survive and having a lot of drama around it in some ways. In that affective pattern, then they get scared that they're too needy and that they're too highly aroused and they're going to get out of control, so they go back and forth between these two cycles. And what happens is they either become too cognitive or too affective. And so the goal with regards to the eating disorder is to teach them how to be able to use cognition and affect and integrate them so that you're not one or the other, but that you're both. And that when you're too cognitive, you become more affective, and when you're too affective, you're able to be more cognitive. And that the analogy I use is like skiing. If you're skiing in Vermont, what you learn to do is you let go and you are flat on your skis and you move really fast, and then at some point you get scared because you're going too fast and you go back onto your edges on the ice and you exert some control and slow down, and you just have this really great fun interplaying between affect and cognition, and this great interplay of over control and being out of control and playing with the two of them in some ways. Now, sex is a great example of this, because in sex, what you're trying to be able to do is to begin to allow yourself to let go and really abandon yourself to pure pleasure and the sensual desire of being close and in love with the person you're in bed with. And then at some point that becomes far too intimate, and perhaps at that point you want to pull back. And you can use sexual fantasies to interplay yourself. You can somehow be able to get close to the other person and then move back. Or, you get distracted when you're making love to somebody and your thoughts go away. And so sometimes I make a lot of metaphor or actual help the client by teaching them to meditate. And if they meditate in the morning and they begin to use a mantra, they begin to have much more control over their thought process. And so instead of being distracted, they can bring themselves to focus on their mantra. And then when they are able to focus on their mantra, then they're able to get back into their breathing and let go. And so by doing that, they begin to exert much more voluntary control over their thought processes. Well, similarly, with making love with somebody, you want to allow yourself to abandon yourself to the sensual feelings coming through your fingertips and through the sensual stimulation of the person in bed with, and look at how beautiful they are and how beautiful their body is, and at the same time feel the sensations in your own body. And at times when that becomes too much, then to interplay it with being able to go back and focus. So your mind gets distracted with thoughts. You might begin to make grocery lists inside your head of things that you forgot to do during the day or whatever, but then you want to bring yourself back to the sensuality. Or you might get distracted and you want to use a sexual fantasy to bring yourself back and forth. But the goal is not to get distracted into a sexual fantasy, but to use it only as a bridge back to the person you're making love with in some way. So let's apply this to the eating disorder. With the eating disorder, if you're at the table, you can really scare yourself by saying, oh God, if I start eating, I'm going to get fat. And if I enjoy this cherry pie, I'm going to get fat. And oh my God, I'm enjoying this cherry pie too much. I better, that kind of thing. And so what your goal is to be able to use what you're learning at the table and use it in the bedroom, and to use what you're using in the bedroom and use it at the table. And so the key aspect is, when you start scaring yourself at the table or you start scaring yourself at the bedroom with thoughts coming in, what you want to do is distract yourself with affect. And when you are really into the affect and it's starting to scare you, you want to go back to cognitions. And so I can't stress how important it is. I'll tell you another example. I was working this week with a client who was doing sex therapy after her eating disorder work. And what she found is that she was able to eat the food fine, but now all of a sudden her over-control went into the bedroom and she became hugely sexually aversive. When you're sexually aversive, you have a phobic response, and sex becomes something that is just terrifying and overwhelming. And you see this with the eating disorder client quite commonly. You would have her sit down when she's reached her barrier weight, and she starts crying at the table and just becomes phobic and overwhelmed with fear. And it's dramatic in its presentation. It's a form of full aversion. And what you want to begin to do is help her begin to notice the anxiety inside her body and begin to use her anxiety management techniques to be able to know that this too will pass, and begin to do proper management so that she doesn't become overwhelmed with the phobia. But she has to feel like she's in control. And the way she feels like she's in control is taste the food, have a bite. If you have a bite, you can have a second bite, but you don't have to eat everything. You decide how and how much you want to be able to eat that food, and a little bit at a time, and that she's in control. Well, similarly, this woman had got through the aversion at the table and her barrier weight, but now, whenever she was making love with her husband, she went into this terror and this fear of overwhelming proportions. And so the key when you're working with a woman who's sexually aversive is that she has to be 100% in control, and she has to know that her partner is not going to violate that. And so she has to trust her partner when she says, when you say, we're not going to have intercourse and we're just going to put breasts and genitals off limits, if the partner goes and touches the breasts and the genitals, then there's no chance that the therapy would work. So you have to really stress that she's in 100% control, and in the short term, he has to understand that she defines how and how much, and that's absolutely essential to break the aversion reflex. Well, very similarly, then you can see that as she begins to realize that she's in control in the bedroom, then she can use that knowledge to know that she's in control at the table. And whenever she gets scared, she can use a very similar kind of thing to be able to deal with that. We call this an aversion reflex. And an aversion reflex can occur at the table, an aversion reflex can occur in the bedroom, and they're almost identical. And your key of that is anxiety management techniques and putting the person in control of how and how much. Okay, I want to get back to your slides so you don't have talking about one thing while you're looking at another. So, in effect, what I'm saying, as you remember, is that there are desire and arousal phase problems, and then there's sexual dysfunction. As you remember, sexual desire is your initiatory behavior, and sexual arousal is the physiologic responsiveness that a person has in the bedroom. And that's separated from sexual dysfunction, where a woman could be vaginismus or dyspareunia, painful intercourse. Vaginismus is an involuntary contraction of the vagina. We see vaginismus here among eating disorder clients, I would say, as often as 20 to 25% of the patients that we see here have vaginismus. Vaginismus is relatively easily reversible with the use of graduated dilators. I do not find a lot of GYNs in the city knowing how to treat vaginismus, and so I do treat it here, and I do have graduated dilators on my desk, and we will introduce that in the context of sex therapy. It's far better if a gynecologist does it, because she can demonstrate the usage of it, in her office. And so if you have a gynecologist who's skilled in this, you're very lucky. But don't rely on that, because unless they've been adequately trained, they will probably not be able to treat the severely vaginismic client. How do you know somebody's vaginismic? It's sometimes very hard to even get a tampon into the vagina. It's put their small finger in their vagina and they won't be able to reach it through, and it's extremely painful. There are other forms of dyspareunia other than vaginismus, and that can be infections of the vagina or just psychosomatic aspects, just like there's pain in other areas that are psychosomatic. We're getting a fair amount of pelvic syndromes where there's a real pelvic pain syndrome, which is psychosomatic in nature. And again, these are treatable mostly through biofeedback. We've used, we have dilators that we're able to put in the vagina that hook up to the biofeedback machine, and a person can begin to exert voluntary control over that and very quickly get rid of the dyspareunia. But here you see you need a fair amount of equipment to be able to do that, and where in town do you find somebody who's got that kind of skill or that kind of equipment? But it's important that you know that it is treatable and that biofeedback is really the treatment of choice for these pelvic pain syndromes, and that they're very common with the eating disorder client. Okay, so in this slide, it's a summary slide, and what it says is if the person has low desire, the key thing is being able to be intimate with their partner and understand the contextual piece of it. And so what I've done is I've separated between what's necessary for the individual and what's necessary for the couple. For the individual, they have to have resolution of flashbacks and post-traumatic sexual traumas. How do you know when the person has adequate resolution of this? Well, if they go into the bedroom and they're having parts jump in and they'll say, oh, it's yucky, it's disgusting, that means the child part is jumping in and the person still has dissociation and, fragmented ego states, and that means that they really haven't done adequate trauma resolution therapy. So you want to go back and ask yourself, what are the necessary steps for trauma resolution and what has not been done? But in some cases, you can do really good trauma work and they're still going to have parts jump in, and so they have to do enough grounding and containment to get these parts to a safe place. And so what we do is have them take 10 or 15 minutes before they do a touching session and ground themselves, get all parts to go to a safe place, and dialogue with their younger parts that are trauma-based and be able to tell them they have no basis in the bedroom. This is with their lover and husband. This is not her perpetrator. If that doesn't work, sometimes we'll do split screen work where we'll have them in their mind see a picture of their perpetrator and then see a picture of their lover, and to be able to say, look, my perpetrator had short hair, my lover has long hair. My perpetrator had blonde hair, my lover has black hair. My perpetrator was old and nasty, my partner is young and beautiful. And begin to separate the two of them in that kind of a way so they can begin to make more distinctions, and that actually can be very effective. So even though these things sound rather simple-minded, they turn out to be, these simple interventions are oftentimes the ones that really make the difference. You have to look at depression, and why I say that is, if they're on serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it just kind of knocks out your sexual arousal, physiologically speaking. And so you can mislabel that and say, look, it must be that I don't love my partner, and in actuality, the SSRIs really get in the way of this. So you might say, what the hell do you do about that? Because they need to be on the SSRIs. And the answer is you can find certain SSRIs that are have less of a side effect. For example, Wellbutrin is a far better SSRI than Paxil, for example, with regards to sexual arousal. There are some psychiatrists who say they all affect sexual desire equally. I don't think that's true. I think that there's some clients who are much more affected by some versus the other. The other thing is that there are these new drugs in the market that are going to affect sexual desire. So just like men are using Viagra and Cialis, there are drugs of similar derivatives that are being experimented on with women that are affecting sexual desire. And it's a good idea to find out what they are and to begin to think about using them with certain clients. You also might think about investing some of your money in them in the stock market, because as they become freed up by the FDA, you'll probably make a fortune. But don't quote me on that, because if you lose your money, I don't want to get sued. Okay, so the next thing is number 6 is the ability to say no. And you know how hard that is for so many of the trauma patients, is to say no or to say yes. And so if they're really oriented to pleasing the partner, or if they feel really guilty because, oh, I put my partner through so much in this eating disorder recovery work, I can't possibly deprive them of sex. And what happens is, the partner looks like they're horny all the time because they haven't had sex in like years, and so they're starving in the middle of the desert without water. And of course, they're having an enormous amount of anxiety and getting started again. So there's this labeling thing where the partner looks like they're hypersexual and they look like they're hyposexual. And you want to really have each of the partners not label themselves in that way. Again, it's very similar to the eating disorder. If you say, I'm anorexic, then it means you have no appetite. If you feel like you're a compulsive overeater, then you see yourself as hungry all the time. And then once you label yourself in that way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So those labels can be very destructive. So I discourage those kind of labeling, and I believe that appetite is situational. There are times when I'm really hungry, and there are times when I'm not very hungry. And I can't tell you, it may be I haven't eaten all day, and at 6 o'clock tonight I'm going to be starved, or it may be that haven't eaten all day, and at 6 o'clock tonight I'm not going to have any appetite. And I can't predict that. And it's really important to know that, because if you predict that in some ways, then you're not really listening to your body cues. So we do a lot of mindfulness kind of exercises. I like a book which is called The Tao of Eating. And in that, it talks a lot about learning how to be able to notice the cues in your body for food appetite. Well, in a very similar way, it's really important to become mindful in your body and to begin to notice the cues for sexual arousal and to give 100% of your attention to those as opposed to over-controlling them or distracting yourself with thoughts, and really allow yourself to feel. And it could be no different. Usually we start in a garden. I may send them out and be able to have them have a sensual experience with a flower and come in and really talk to me about that. Or it could be in the shower when they're drying themselves. We'll have them feel a real fluffy towel and to notice the difference in a really fluffy towel versus a scratchy towel, and to describe that in great length. And as they're able to do that, they get better at using words to articulate feelings. And, that's actually part of the therapy, because you're going to see a lot of alexithymia. Alexithymia is the inability to put words to emotional states. And the better they get at putting words to emotional states, the more mindful they are able to become and the more sensual. One time I had to learn all the genus and species of the trees outside, and I had to do that by looking just at their leaves or their bark. And I hated it at the time, but now every single time I walk by a tree, I look at the leaf and I look at the bark, and I know the genus and I know the species, and it's like mind-blowing how much I enjoy trees right now. But in a very similar way, as a person begins to become more mindful and is able to label the experience, it really enhances it amazingly. And just to feel like when somebody touches your lips are so sensual. And I don't know, try touching your lips for a minute. I want everyone at the other end of the computer touching their lips. See, you thought you would do this. And notice how sensual your lips are. Aren't they wonderful? And, you take all that for granted. Touch your ear for a minute, really lightly. Your ear is such an incredibly erotic kind of thing. And, your lips and your ears are just filled with nerve endings that are just delicious. And, to begin to have them play with that is, now think about it in terms of, cherry blackberry pie and how tart a cherry pie is and what it feels like on your tongue to taste a tart cherry. You see the analogy in the metaphors? There's so many similarities between it. So if you can begin to help use your sex therapy to increase your eating disorder work and to use your eating disorder work to increase your sex therapy, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. And of course, that's why people with one oftentimes have problems with the other. Also, anorexics have trouble with pleasure. They feel guilty whenever they experience any pleasure. They have a hard time having fun and playing. They feel like they should be working all the time. Well, what happens when you work at sex? Well, think about it. I am going to work at sex. Tonight, I am going to spend an hour in bed, and we are going to have the best sex of our life. And what we're going to do is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And you set up this big appetite and this big kind of menu of things that you're going to do. You're going to get candles, and then you're going to get dildos, and then you're going to get Benoit bubble things, and all this crap. And the more you do all that stuff, it's like what happened with just touching somebody's ears and touching their lips. And so you can hear the way I'm talking that you with words have to make making love delicious. In the same way you can make eating food delicious. And you want to inspire them with your words. Do you know what you're missing? Do you know how delicious? Most eating disorder clients love food. I mean, they spend hours looking, in these magazines and thinking about this menu you, and because they're starving to death, they're obsessed with food anyway. So, in a very similar kind of way, you want to begin to change people's appetites. Now, there is this thing about attitudes. If I think eating food is disgusting, and let's say I think that creamy things are really horrible and they remind me of ejaculate. Oh, God. Well, what are you going to do about that? You got white creamy foods off your list, Well, what one has to do is some sort of systematic desensitization and make white creamy things not so negatively associated. So, how would you want to do that? Well, in your hand, let's say you put white creamy Lubriderm lotion, or their favorite cream that they use. So,
Sam, you have a call on Park 1. Sam, you have a call on Park 1.
You get to hear my phone. Sorry about that. Anyway, so you got Lubriderm in your hand, or your favorite lotion, or the favorite scented lotion. You put it in your hand, and it's white and creamy. So you can begin then with fantasy to imagine white creamy stuff. Now, let's say you put an egg white in somebody's other hand. What's the difference between an egg white and Lubriderm? Let's feel them both in your hand, and let's begin to be mindful. Instead of judging them or evaluating them, let's just describe what you feel. You see what you just did? You did Sensate Focus with a lotion and with an egg white, and eventually you can neutralize the egg white's stigma or pre-associations by doing that. So if you're able to do that with food, similar with sex, let's say a person is absolutely aversive to ejaculate. Can you think of any way of making ejaculate a more positive experience? Well, I think you could. And again, what you might do is put Lubriderm or their favorite lotion in one hand and put a little bit of ejaculate in that lotion. Ooh, how disgusting, that's horrible. But if you're in the room with the client just one-on-one, it can be done. But what kind of therapist is going to bring a little bit of ejaculate into the therapy session? You'd probably think only Mark Schwartz would do that. And the answer is yes, Mark Schwartz would do that, because it would be a pretend ejaculate, because you can go out and you can buy yourself a lot of these creams in the drugstore, which are kind of lubricating kind of lotions that have the same viscous kind of sensations anyways. So you see my point, which is you do that all the time with food, and you wouldn't think that was so weird if you were dealing with white creamy stuff. Well, why is that any different in dealing with the ejaculate? It's just our stigma sometimes as therapists that we hate to even talk about these things, but my comfort level in talking to you about that is contagious to the client, and therefore you want to get better at being able to talk like I'm talking, and not make your face squirm every time you say the word ejaculate, or kind of make your nose squint every time you say the word masturbation. And the only way to do that is to be able to listen to these kinds of talks and help yourself feel more comfortable. Okay. Now I want to turn away from the sex therapy piece of it and say something about relationships, because at least I would say 60 to 70% of sex therapy is relational therapy. And you can't separate sex therapy from relational therapy. They go hand in hand. And so as we're talking about enhancing the eating disorder, enhancing sexuality, we're also talking about doing something to make the relationship more intense. As your primary relationship is with food, it means your secondary relationship is with people. And so if you're a sex addict and your primary relationship is with fucking and pornography, then you have a secondary relationship with your partner. So what you want is abstinence from sexual addiction and abstinence from eating disorder. And then as you do that, there's going to be much more affect freed up and much less control from cognition, and the possibility of allowing yourself to begin more secure attachment. A secure attachment is integration of cognition and affect. Secure attachment is high mindfulness, and secure attachment means that you begin to do things on a day-by-day basis to exert voluntary control over enhancing the quality of your relationship. If I said to you, I want for you and your partner, so Kim, I'll take you. Kim's one of the people in the room with me. And I said, I'll give you $5,000 cash if this weekend you have the best weekend of your life with your partner. And you said, are you kidding me? $5,000 cash? And I said, it has to be the best weekend of your life with your partner. And here's $5,000 cash. What would you do?
I would just have whatever weekend I wanted and then tell you it was the best.
She said she'd have whatever weekend she wanted and lie to me. Okay. Because she's not an object and she's not going to make performance orientation. Well, you wouldn't get your $5,000. Okay. So that may sound like an absurd question, but in fact, that would be a lot of fun because it would be like planning a gourmet meal. You would, plan a trip to Santa Fe, and you would go to your favorite restaurant in Santa Fe and have your favorite meal. And then you decide you're not going to sleep that night, but you're going to take this great walk on your favorite mountain range, and, you're going to have coffee brought to you by a limousine service on, top of the service. I don't know what the hell you'd do, but whatever it is, you would have so much fun because money would not be the object, and you would just be interested in every one of your sensualities, touch, taste, smell, hearing, and be able to do that. Now, at the end of that weekend, how would you feel towards your new husband? Any different than you do now?
Probably not.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'll bet you $5,000 that you would, have a hard time leaving him, probably. It's like you would feel so close to him and so connected and so intimate. So what's my point? My point is simply that there are ways that we enhance the quality of our relationship. And there are things that we can do. Now, if you could do that this weekend for $5,000, why can't you do it this weekend for no money at all? People have the ability to exert voluntary control over increasing the quality of their relationship. And there are many things that they can do to do that. But people don't realize, they think it's just supposed to happen automatically. If you thought, oh, my car is going to tune itself up automatically, you'd probably find your engine needing an overhaul relatively soon. But it takes a certain amount of effort to notice that your car isn't running so well and you need to be able to tune it up. So my point is simply that there's a lot of that goes into relationship enhancement. And we give people usually 2 to 3 hours of homework assignments every day to improve the quality of their relationship. And I borrow a lot from Gottman's work, and I've given copies of that to you in this handout. The problem is that really isn't marital therapy. Marital therapy, that's behavioral marital therapy, but marital therapy has much more to do with what Freeman talks about here, which is in the second line. Unfinished business doesn't allow for a thoughtful, creative response to a here and now situation. Rather, it triggers an emotionally reactive response. What that means is that most relationships are built upon flashback. And what you do is you take unfinished business with your family of origin, you project it upon your partner as if you're in a bad soap opera, you recreate it in your relationship, and then you find yourself angry at your partner in the way you're angry at your father who rejected you and abandoned you. And, there's a favorite phrase I like, which is that I often say when I think about my relationship with my ex-wife, which is, my script probably was something like this. If you don't abandon me, I'll find someone who will. And if you think about that, that was my script. I was going to do something to get her to abandon me just like my mother did. And, when she was very, very committed, I had to be enough of a jerk that even she would leave me, and if not, I'll find someone who will. Well, clearly, doing marital therapy between the two of us isn't really what we need, and, doing a trip to Santa Fe isn't really what we need. What we needed was for me to look at the unfinished business with my mom and to see how I was recreating it in my relationship with my wife. And that's the cornerstone of good marital therapy. And really, with eating disorder and with sexual compulsivity, it's always about unfinished business in the family of origin. Now, you could say it's a more psychodynamic approach, and that's what Freeman's book is the psychodynamic approaches to marital therapy. And I certainly think that's where it's at. And so what happens is that there's a cognitive piece to this, and I just show you some of the cognitive pieces, which is, others will disappoint me, but this person will be different. I'm bad, destructive, and evil, and I deserve someone who's good. There are polarized parts of self that somehow believe one thing and believe the other. So if I used myself in my relationship, I felt like we would be together forever, and I also thought that eventually she would abandon me. And you can have these contradictory polarized beliefs exist at the same time, and you feel like you're nuts. But the truth is that both parts exist, both parts exert voluntary control or involuntary control, and before you know it, you have a civil war going on inside where parts are fighting one another, where on Monday, you're going to Santa Fe, and on Wednesday, you say, well, let's not talk on the phone anymore, I'm bored. And, you see how it manifests itself. I have a friend right now who really has a hard time, talking to their one they love on the phone. They talk once a week, and a friend asked me, what's that about? And, what it's about is an intimacy disorder. And, her partner has the same problem I had, which is, if you won't abandon me, I'll find someone who will. And if he doesn't get some therapy for that, their relationship will have great difficulties. And so one has to look at these contradictions, and I've just, like one of them is, I make bad things happen, but it's not my fault. Well, do you create bad things, or do they just happen? And it's important to begin to look at these sort of contradictions inside. Now, we're running low on time, so I want to move on to Gottman. And I just want to say, if you haven't read Gottman's book, The Marriage Clinic, it's really absolutely, go out and buy it tonight. It's just an amazing book. It's one of those books that just took my breath away, and it changed everything. After being a marital therapist for 20 years, I burned all my old books and started reading nothing but Gottman. And he's just terrific. Now, actually, that's a lie, because you can see my Freeman book is still very strong on my bookshelf. But truthfully, what Gottman says is that, of 35% of couples making initial gains in marital therapy, 30 to 50% relapsed in 2 years, 44% divorced within 5 years, and so on down the line. And you can't argue with these data. Most marital therapists were grotesquely ineffective. And so doing traditional marital therapy, which is really cognitive behavioral marital therapy, is necessary but not sufficient. And what one has to do is begin to look at what Gottman is saying, which is that what makes a good relationship are the number of positives in the relationship in proportion to the number of negatives. And there are things that people do. For example, men stonewall, and that really hurts a relationship. One of the things that Gottman found that was so interesting was that, you ask yourself, if a woman is angry, is that good for a relationship or bad for a relationship? And the answer is, it's good for a relationship for a woman to be angry, but it's bad for a relationship for a man to be angry. Well, that's important to know that, because here you might be spending all this time working on decreasing the woman's anger, when in actuality, anger is probably a good sign. Why? Because it means you're not willing to put up with this shit anymore. And what I mean by that is that, you get what you accept and expect in a relationship. If you expect to be mistreated and you're willing to accept being mistreated in a relationship, then your boundaries are poor and you're going to have a bad relationship. And so beginning to change those boundaries and demand to have more and more, and demand to have one of those, $5,000 weekends every weekend is really important. So I give you this list of different kinds of intimacy on slide number 31, which I find really helpful. I just like say, okay, pick one off of each of these lists and do it this Friday. So I'll come back to Kim. I say, okay, this weekend I want you to have one form of sexual intimacy, I want you to have one form of creative intimacy, and one form of spiritual intimacy this weekend. And I want you to come back and tell me which one you do, and I'd like them all to be really of high quality. Well, people are surprised they can actually do that, and they love it, and they wonder why they don't do it all the time. And these forms of intimacy, you sometimes, if you have boring people, they make boring relationships. And so you have to begin to teach people that their creativity is in all of us, and the answer to boredom is creativity and going outside your comfort level and trying some things that are a little bit uncomfortable. And so, I don't have an abandon the CBT piece of this, but at the same time, we begin to look at other forms. Here, the intellectual intimacy, the work intimacy, communication intimacy. So you have to do a lot of that. Now, what does that have to do with sex therapy? If you have really good fun tonight, if you're doing something really creative, if you're reading poetry to each other, sitting on top of a cliff and really enjoying the hell out of each other, it's only natural to move over and begin to play with someone's ear and touch their lips. And good sensuality follow out of those good feelings inside. And so you never want to rip sexuality out of the context of the relationship. So when you can build that kind of intimacy outside the bedroom, then you can build the intimacy naturally inside the bedroom. And, so this next slide is just sex. It works on many levels. You want to have them on fire. And fire is where they are electric. And electric means that you are having this incredible conversation about something that's exciting, and then you kiss each other, and all your juices are running. Now, so we talked about juices, and guess what? Now I moved to testosterone. I've got a bad sense of humor. Anyway, if you've got an eating disorder, your hormones are going to be out of whack. Particularly if you have PTSD. PTSD means your cortisol system is out of whack, and that oftentimes throws your testosterone. So testosterone is produced by the ovary and by the adrenals, and you get a little testosterone from your ovary, and you get a little androstenedione and dihydrotestosterone from your adrenals that then becomes converted into testosterone. And so it's a good idea to know that A, that testosterone is in the system, and B, that there's not end organ insensitivity. And so, you get varieties of hirsutism or varieties of end organ sensitivity with eating disorder clients, and know that, when someone's got an eating disorder, they are screwing up their metabolism. And it's not surprising that their hormones are going to be out of whack. So really work with a good gynecologist who understands that you've got to work with androgens as well as estrogens. And a lot of these new birth control pills have just a touch of testosterone in it and can give you a fairly high boost in your sexual drive, particularly if you have deprivation. Now, as a sex therapist, the key word is called entitlement. And so on page 36, what you do is this. You give person permission not to be sexual. Now, you say, you do what? And the answer is, think about it for a minute. If you have a relationship where you and your partner are not friends, if you have a relationship where you are afraid to have fun, if you have a relationship where you don't know how to play, if you have a relationship where the two of you have your heads in a computer all the time, if you have a relationship where you're fighting all the time, then should you be sexually aroused all the time? Absolutely not. So why do people expect themselves to have all this sexual appetite when indeed, they're spending all their time on their iPhones and running emails to people, when they should be attending to lectures, things like that. So, you got to throw your goddamn iPhone away and be able to really be with somebody 100%, because you don't really know, how distracting all that can be. So if you have your iPhone in bed with you, you are entitled not to feel sexual. And you know what I mean. So, there are a lot of people who think that all these electronics that we're getting, are just ruining relationships, and I certainly would agree with that. I think that you've got to throw it away, throw away your goddamn phone, and from 8 to 10 o'clock at night, give your partner 100% of your attention, and, get your head out of your computer, get your head out of the television, and really be with somebody, and do something that's relationship enhancing, and sexuality will naturally follow from that. So what would be the conditions that would allow a person to feel sexual, and what would be the conditions that would allow a couple to feel sexual? And until you've been able to create that within the context of the therapy, don't expect the body to work, because the body only works in a natural sort of way when two people adore each other, when people can let go and have fun, and when people can really play with each other. Get my message? So the key concept is you're not going to have Harold Robbins kind of sex. You're not going to be intimate. You're not going to be vulnerable. You're not going to just adore each other. You're not going to have those tickly kind of sensations on your earlobes if you are, focused on, what am I going to do, my computer, what am I going to do in the next program, if you're doing, those kinds of things in your head. So the key concept of Masters and Johnson, which almost nobody ever got in the sex therapy field, is using the relationship as a vehicle for change. Okay? Now what the hell does that mean? Which is that when you and I our team, we can do anything. You know, let's say you and I have a relationship, and let's say we don't know what to do because we have $150 worth of bills and we only have $100 in our checking account. Can we solve that problem? Absolutely. You and I together can figure out how to be able to turn $100 into $150 tonight by magic. All we have to do is, instead of yelling at each other and saying, you know, you bought Oreo cookies when you went to the grocery store, you know, or, you know, what are you doing spending all that money on that nonsense, or we can't go out for dinner, you know, when we fight with each other, that's not going to solve the problem. But if we use our creativity, the two of us together in a we identity can solve any problem. And so Jacobson called that acceptance. Acceptance in a relationship means that the two of us are on the same team and we externalize the problem, and the two of us are against the problem rather than against each other. And the same thing happens with sex. If you and I want to enhance the quality of our relationship, and you say that, you know, you don't love me and I don't feel attractive because you don't love me, and you feel threatened by the fact that I don't have any appetite, and I, on the other hand, you know, say, you know, I'm not sure if we're going to have a future for this relationship. I think we might separate. Well, you know, every single day, every single moment, we're going to evaluate whether our marriage is going to survive or not on the basis of whether you turn me on or I turn you on. Well, there's no chance for that to be able to work. But if we make a commitment and we say, look, we're in this together. I love you, you love me. The two of us together can solve this problem. We're going to externalize the problem, and we're going to get some help and deal with that problem rather than being with each other. It changes the whole set. And I swear to God that in 5 days, I can take a couple who absolutely have no interest in sex, and I can have them really have high appetite for sexual arousal. And that's what Masters and Johnson did. I don't think people realize how potent what Masters and Johnson did, which was they took couples who had never had any sexual interest in one another. In 5 to 7 days, they changed that whole around. But the way they did that was not through some sort of sexual gymnastics. The way they did that was they helped them create an interaction where they made a commitment and they were together and they had a we identity, and it was we against the problem in some ways. So what I'm saying to you is it's the process of therapy. It's the set by which someone enters the therapy that makes it effective. It's not the technique. And so, yeah, these techniques are great, but what you have to create before they work is that the couple feel like a united front and that we're there against the team. So yesterday I had a couple come in, again with an eating disorder. We reversed the eating disorder. We're now working with the couple stuff, and I said to him, listen, you know, you ought to go live in an apartment. You need to go live somewhere else. You two, you can't live with each other. You got a crappy relationship. You got a crappy marriage, you know, and we can't possibly think about sex because, you know, things are so bad in this relationship. And they looked at me and they got really scared and they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I know you love each other, but, you know, the two of you, how can you possibly have a relationship, you know, when you're like you are? So anyway, what we began to do was work in Gottman style and beginning to increase the quality of the relationship. I scared them half to death, and now they're really working on their relationship, and they're making a commitment to each other and trying to show me wrong. And now I'll begin the sex therapy on top of that. But there has to be a kind of a commitment. But if every single day they're deciding whether they're going to stay together or they're deciding whether it's going to work or not, or, you know, using their body responsiveness as an indicator of whether they're lovable or not. Whenever a man is in a relationship with a woman who has low sexual desire, he does not love himself, because it's really hard to love yourself when the person you're in bed with isn't turned on. And so what he needs is a lot of work and beginning to look in the mirror and like himself again, because he's been devastated by the fact that his partner has been unable to show love or say love. So he's going to have to get it in other ways, and she's going to have to verbalize and find him beautiful and terrific in so many ways and tell him that before he's going to be able to respond. So it gets me to Sensate Focus, which is Sensate Focus is simply a tool. It's a diagnostic tool. And so I'm going to have you and your partner go into bed tonight, and you're going to touch each other, breasts and genitals off limits, and you're going to do it in a sensual way from head to toe, to front to back. And since it's 12:59, I'm probably going to have to stop. But I think you get the point, which is, you know, it's not about sexual gymnastics. It's about building an affectional interchange where two people in the bedroom and they feel like they're completely safe, they feel really connected to one another, and when they feel safe and connected, I promise you sexual arousal will occur. It's as sure as you're breathing or you're digesting right now. You can bet on it. Your body works. You just have to feel safe and connected while you're in the bedroom. Also, you need to be able to be mindful and be able to integrate cognition and affect sufficiently. So anyway, I've written some new papers on this. You can get them on our website. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, I'll be publishing them, and they're on much of what I've talked about in much more detail, so you can get it off of that. Well, let's turn now to questions.
So Mark, the first question that I have is, first of all, what's the name of the Freeman book that you referenced?
Psychoanalytic or psychodynamic psychotherapy with couples.
Okay, so Psychodynamic Therapy with Couples is the name of that Freeman book. And then the next question is, can you say more about the gender difference of anger in relationship?
Well, these are Gottman's data, and they really seem true to me in a clinical sense, which is that when men are angry, it seems to be destructive to the relationship. And the way he gets that is he correlates it. He just finds how many of his relationships are successful and unsuccessful, and how many of his therapies are successful and unsuccessful, and correlates it with the frequency of these behaviors in the relationship. And what he finds is when women are angry, it actually helps the therapy because it energizes change. But when men are angry, it's really destructive. They attack the partner, and they devastate the partner, and they get them into power struggles of a variety of sorts. So that's what he bases it on. Now, I wouldn't go out there, but, if you think about it, Bowlby talked about that there are 3 things that happen. There's anger, and then it moves to sadness, and then it moves to apathy. And which is the worst of the 3? Apathy. If you have people who are in apathy, it's almost like they've got to get angry first to be able to produce change, because when they're in apathy, there is no change. And so if a woman is apathetic, she's at that 3rd phase, and you're going to have to get her angry first in order to be able to elicit some of the change variables. And so, I like activating women's anger because it produces change in a positive way. So there's, positive anger and there's negative anger. And you can define anger on the basis of if it's positive anger, it means it increases the probability of change. If it's negative anger, it decreases the probability of change. So a woman has negative anger, it's important to begin to help turn it into positive anger. And so usually she's blaming the partner for her own distress, and what you want to begin to do is help her see that, that they both have 100% contribution to the problem. In any marriage, there's a 200% contribution to all problems. And if she's miserable, she contributed to that 100%, and he contributed to it 100%.
Okay, and the next question is, how do the relationship dynamics change when the man in a heterosexual relationship is the one with the eating disorder history?
Yeah, when the man has the eating disorder, and we shortchange men in these discussions, but what I find is that there are huge differences among men who have eating disorders. And so it's really hard for me to talk about one syndrome. Same thing's true for women. But with men, there are certain ones that, our experience is they tend to be softer, sweeter, warmer, more sensitive, and highly reactive. And so those are really good characteristics for a relationship because they're really components of androgyny, and more androgynous men tend to make happier marriages and more successful marriages. And so I like using those qualities and building it into the relationship in a complementary way. But again, I think that some of the same issues are there, and so the man is going to be aversive and have lots of stuff come up whenever he's exposing his nude body. And so what you want to be able to use is the woman's ability to love him, care for him, and adore him to begin to change his image of himself. And the goal is to begin to have the man love himself, and the woman's love seeds the development of that. That's a very common thing in our society where women's love of men help them hate themselves less. Unfortunately, it's not the other way around. What you really wish is that men's love of women would help them hate themselves less. But men have not learned how to be demonstrative and show women how much they love them on an ongoing basis, and allow the woman to be able to receive that. Okay, final thought. Final thought is, if you haven't thought about this, when you're finished with the eating disorder phase of treatment where you really feel like the eating disorder is under control and the person is not as eating disordered at the table, consider doing relational and sex therapy. It will make your eating disorder resolution so much more effective. You think you're doing it because you want to improve the sexual and relational health of the couple, and that's certainly a goal, but in truth, it actually cements the eating disorder treatment in a way that nothing else can. Thank you for being with us, and goodbye.